Check, check. Green is good.
That cultivates Asian, oh, thank you. That cultivates Asian American, Native Hawaiian, and Pacific Islander public service leaders by providing formative public professional experiences and growth opportunities through our annual programs, which include the WLP. WLP is one of our signature free programs that introduce students to AANHPI leaders in public service. And this summer's WLP series was actually led by a group of our recent scholars and intern alumni. So thank you to the planning committee. All of our sessions are recorded and live streamed to our YouTube page and will be available for later viewing afterwards, including the materials. Today's conversation is on Asian American and Native Hawaiian Pacific Islander food sovereignty and culture, the politics of food. Our conversation today will focus on food access and security on AANHPI communities, especially during the pandemic, as well as weaving in the impacts that food insecurity and food security can have on mental health. For me, my background is as a public school teacher, and I currently am a consultant with education, and I am reminded every day of the importance of food security to whole person health and to economic mobility for students and families. So I'm really looking forward to learning more through the conversation today. There will also be an audience survey following the panel discussion, and we'll also be able to respond to questions at the end. We also invite all of you to stay after the session to hang out and get to know us, and we're really excited to get to know you as well. I also want to give a special thank you to our 2023 sponsors, Moapia and Comcast, for making tonight possible. A tremendous thank you to Hogan Lovells for donating this space to us. And another thank you to Bonafide Mass for donating their materials in kind for our sessions. With that, it is my pleasure to introduce LaMonica Jones. LaMonica joined DC Hunger Solutions, an initiative of the Food Research and Action Center, in September 2021, and currently serves as interim director, overseeing the daily operations of ending hunger in the nation's capital by developing strategies that marry policy with practice while providing support and outreach to the district's most vulnerable populations. Previously, LaMonica served as the Procurement and Purchasing Compliance Advisor with the Georgia Department of Early Learning and Care, working with the Nutrition Services Division, providing technical assistance and monitoring oversight for children's nutrition program providers, participating in the Child and Adult Food Care Program and Summer Food Service Program. With that, would love to kick it up to you, LaMonica, if you would like to introduce yourself further and share more about what drew you to working in this area.
Yeah, so thank you. Good evening, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for having me here. Yeah, what kind of drew me into this work that I'm doing is it started off, like you mentioned, the procurement and the purchasing compliance, very accidental. I had always wanted to be a federal prosecutor since I was in the 5th grade. Took my LSAT and decided I didn't want to sit in a courtroom all day long. Was more interested in the policy and the advocacy piece of the work that I was doing. And so I moved to Atlanta and became a high school teacher. And that kind of started the advocacy space, working with my high school students who were experiencing low income. So they lived well below the poverty line, unlike some of their classmates who were from very wealthy families. And from there, with the procurement background, kind of share with everyone, does everyone remember that very first Transformers movie with Shia LaBeouf? I worked for the company that designed all those cars. And so that was like my first intro into purchasing and procurement from an engineering standpoint. But from there, having a family that was involved in food-based businesses, my father was a franchise owner operator, I learned the background of food. And so pricing food, sourcing food, getting food from a restaurant perspective, and utilize my procurement background to kind of further my understanding. And so putting all of that together, high school teacher, working in procurement and compliance, is kind of how I got to the state agency in Georgia. But working in Georgia, the communities in Georgia experienced a lot of disinvestment. There was a lot of racial inequities that existed in Georgia, not just with the students in school or that attended childcare centers and daycare homes, but when it came to those that were sourcing programs and products in Georgia. And so I did a lot of work with farmers, Black farmers, minority farmers, women-owned farmers, to kind of get them acclimated and introduced to our federal programs, because a lot of times what happened, the two didn't know the other one existed. So childcare providers, daycare homes didn't know, how do I source locally? So that kind of just translated into a passion for making sure that we're really advocating for our vulnerable communities and our vulnerable populations. And so when the opportunity arose, I decided to move to DC and to extend that further. with working with childcare providers. So when I started with DC Hunger Solutions, I was the child nutrition program analyst. So I worked with all of the child nutrition programs in DC. So school meals, WIC, SNAP, as well as all of our child care daycare home programs, CACFP, which is the child and adult food care program. And so really working to make sure that child care centers are aware that they can be reimbursed for serving a meal to the kids that are attending their center, advocating for policy at DC Council level. So the Healthy Tots Act, the Healthy Student Amendment, the WIC Expansion Act, really advocating for our child care providers, our daycare homes, as well as our families and individuals that are participating. And so it's kind of a very short roundup of how this all happened. But yeah.
That's amazing. Thank you for sharing all that, LaMonica. Your experience is incredible.
Thank you.
So with all the work you've been doing now, well, I guess primarily with DC Hunger Solutions, but even prior, what effects have you seen with the COVID-19 pandemic on food access and the food industry, as well as the ability of local communities to have sustainable sources of food security?
So COVID people weren't experiencing hunger as a result of COVID. It just amplified, and it really showcased that there are people that are experiencing hunger. You can never look at me and I can never look at you and say that you're not hungry or that you're not experiencing hunger. And hunger is not just that I have not had anything to eat today. I may not have had enough to eat. And so COVID really amplified that, and it really elevated the fact that we do have communities all across the district that are experiencing some form of hunger. Currently, DC is in the top 3 when it comes to older adult hunger at about 13%. So there are the majority of our older adults that reside in Ward 3 has the highest percentage of older adults in the district, but the majority of our older adults that reside in DC are experiencing some form of hunger. And we lead the nation with that. And so COVID, the public health emergency really amplified that. It also amplified the disinvestments that occur in our communities. So I'm assuming you all are from DC or you've been in DC for a little while. So we know that in Ward 7 and 8, specifically east of the river, that's where we experience our largest disinvestment. So when we look at our communities that are east of the Anacostia River, in Ward 8, there's only one grocery store for about 100,000 residents. In Ward 7, prior to the redistricting that happened in 2021, there were 3 grocery stores. So for all these 100,000 residents that live in Ward 7 and 8, we only had 4 grocery stores. For comparison, in Ward 3, I believe there's 16, just in Ward 3. And so taking that and coupling it with those other social determinants of health, so those other key factors that are related to hunger or related to food access, so transportation, high quality childcare, affordable housing, economic security, all of those factors begin to play into food access. And COVID just amplified that. It let us see that we really do have to make some intentional investments into our communities, especially those that are east of the Anacostia River. And so we worked with DC Council, with our community partners, to bring on initiatives and programs that would support companies and individuals that have a vested interest in supporting residents that live in Ward 7 and 8 east of the Anacostia. And so we have the Fresh Food Fund as well as Nourish DC Collaborative, and both of those offer incentives to business owners, support for small businesses. So if you're a small business, likely you have some sort of challenge. You don't have the same access as like a much larger company or organization when it comes to doing business in DC. And so Nourish DC Collaborative provides additional technical assistance, mentoring support so that you can be a successful food-based business in DC. And so we worked with DC Council to make sure, and DC Food Policy Council, to make sure that there was intentional support for these companies and these organizations to support food access and increase access and decrease the inequities that Ward 8 east of the Anacostia, that those residents particularly experience. So again, COVID didn't it wasn't because of COVID or because of the pandemic, but what it did is that it just further elevated it and heightened that we need to make some intentional investments all around implementing policy, addressing our programs, how do they function, to make sure that we're doing a better job of assessing food access and insecurity in the district.
And my next question is kind of diving a little deeper within the AANHPI community. Obviously, we know that the majority of residents in Ward 7 or 8 and 8 are Black Americans, African Americans. But what nuances have you seen through your work, either in DC or before, within the AANHPI community in terms of food accessibility or the conversation across the board?
So I'll speak to it from a perspective of before I moved to DC, because I really see it for our Black and Latinx communities here in DC in Ward 7 and 8. Those communities experience the most disinvestment. Before, when I lived in Atlanta, when right in the middle of COVID, a lot of the challenges for our program providers that were participating in summer food service, which is another federal reimbursable program that was in operation, as well as CACFP, again, the Child and Adult Food Care Program. And a lot of the conversation that I would have, not just from our Asian communities, but for our other communities of color, was that we don't have enough sources for the food items that the residents in our communities are consuming. And so how do we get a variety of food choices? Now we're stepping into conversations of not just food access and insecurity, but we're having questions on the food inequities. Now we're experiencing where we have communities that I don't eat these same foods that white Americans eat. And so, but we don't have sources. How can I buy my food? We're having inflation issues. There's supply chain shortages that are in effect. People aren't delivering because of COVID. And so the conversations that I would often hear a lot would be, how do I make sure that I'm able to feed the people in these communities, the residents in these communities, because I serve as a vital resource to make sure that our older adults, that our children, our families in general, are able to have access to a healthy meal and just food in general, right? Basic human right. And so a lot of the work that I did, just being in the purchasing and procurement space, was kind of thinking of creative ideas to meet that need. So it's not going to come in the form of working with grocery stores because they had limited access, but it was making sure that restaurants that typically serve families that they're accustomed to going to on a weekend basis, everyday basis, encouraging them to alter their business model to serve these families. And that proved to be a strategy that worked. So with a lot of our federal programs, you have meal pattern requirements that you have to follow in order to be reimbursed for that meal. And so the encouragement came from our program providers as well as from the restaurant owners to alter their business model because of COVID, number one, to remain sustainable as a business in their community, but also to serve the residents in that community. And so a lot of them were able to alter that, slightly tweak their menus so that they're able to serve and meet those meal pattern requirements. But a lot of the conversation that I would receive and a lot of the questions would be, you know, these food items are not accessible. And I still hear that. Those are still questions and comments that I hear now. Is I go to my local grocery store and they don't have meal components or food items that I'm accustomed to preparing at home. And we know that typically if we want to make sure that someone is receiving the nutrition that they're eating, they're receiving their food, we want to prepare meals that they're accustomed to eating. So like when I've again, big background in child nutrition. And so to make sure that we're increasing the amount of food that a child is consuming, we want to prepare meals that they're accustomed to eating at home. And so if that meal is based off of their ethnicity and their culture, we want to prepare a culturally relevant and a culturally diverse meal offering to them. And so that means that those places where we're purchasing those food items, whether a grocery store, whether a food service distributor, we have to work to make sure that they're able to meet that need. And so those are a lot of the conversations that existed prior to COVID and prior to the public health emergency, but that are just continuously ongoing that we have to work through.
Thank you. I know earlier you had mentioned, and I'll repeat it again in case folks that came in didn't hear it, that there's only one grocery store for folks in Ward 7 and 8. I would love if you could talk a little more about the politics of food distribution there, especially in DC, as it's facing our Black and Latinx communities here.
Yeah, so east of the Anacostia River, we have a total of 4 grocery stores. There's one in Ward 8, and that is the Giant on Alabama Avenue. And then in Ward 7, there are 3. So there's 2 Safeways, there is a Lidl, and then there will be another one opening up in 2024 in the Capitol Beltway space. So between Ward 7 and 8, east of the Anacostia, there will be 5 grocery stores for about 100,000 residents. And so we have to ask questions. So we release a grocery store report every year, which talks about the lack of grocery store access in the district, as well as the inequities that involve the grocery stores, where they're placed, how they're placed, which grocery stores we choose to open up in a given area, as well as viable solutions for DC Council to implement that would address the lack of grocery stores. And so I won't say that it's politicized. I won't say that, but we do know that there is historic disinvestment that goes on in Ward 7 and 8. But we can't talk about bringing grocery stores to the district without having, to those specific areas in the district, without having conversations about how do we make sure that people can access the grocery store. So it's not just a conversation on let's bring a grocery store to Ward 7 and 8. The first thing is, how can we make sure that they get to the grocery store? Do they have adequate transportation? If they don't have a car, do they have access to Metro? We know that as of June 20th, Metro is offering a reduced fare rate for SNAP participants. And so does everybody have the ability to sign up for that so that they can get the Metro? Is the grocery store on the Metro line? And then once you get to the grocery store, can I afford the items in the grocery store? So there's all these layers and layers and layers that we have to address. It's not just simply, let's throw a grocery store in an area. Let's just put a Whole Foods. Everybody wants Whole Foods, right? Everybody can't afford a Whole Foods. I can barely afford Whole Foods and I love it. And so it's everybody wants access to the freshest and most nutritious items available. And everyone deserves access because food is a basic human right. But we have to build conversations on the infrastructure and the other things that are touching food. Like I always remind my team and say out, loud, that we don't silo ourselves in food. We can't just talk about just food. We have to talk about all those important players when it comes to food. And so when we're talking about increasing grocery store access, we have to talk about transportation. We have to talk about affordability. We have to talk about product availability. We have to talk about the quality of food that is inside of the grocery store. Is it equitable? Are the residents inside that live in Ward 3, are they receiving, or the Ward 8, are they receiving the same type and same access and same freshness of food that the residents in Ward 3 or Ward 2 are receiving? And so we have to work through, we ask questions through our grocery store report. Why is there so much disinvestment? And for those that are interested in doing business in DC, specifically in Ward 7 and 8, making sure that they understand the dynamics and the demographics of the residents that live east of the river. So knowing that these are primarily residents that have a much lower income. For comparison's sake, Ward 3 is our highest income earning ward in the district. And so the average income is $121,000 in Ward 3. In Ward 7 and 8, I believe it's $47,000 is the median income. And so making sure that, and the majority of the residents that live in Ward 7 and 8 participate in SNAP and WIC. And so that doesn't mean that they deserve less access. Doesn't mean that they deserve only a certain type of grocery store, but that means that if you know that there's a high concentration of individuals that are participating in a certain nutrition benefit program, that when these stores come into the district, that these stores also offer those products. They accept SNAP benefits, they accept WIC benefits, and that their product availability is equitable. So if they're coming into a primarily Asian community, what are the types of food items that the residents in these community would like to see inside their grocery store? And so giving people the power, which now we're talking about food sovereignty. Now we're talking about making sure that those residents have the power to choose. You know, we may be bringing a Lidl into the grocery store or into the district, but making sure that they offer the types of products that are going to serve that community. And so having these conversations. So it's a lot that goes into making sure that we're servicing that. And we discuss that through our grocery store report.
No, thank you for all that insight. And I think it's amazing to think about how all of the levers like have to come together to really be able to provide that access and be able to empower people to have that food sovereignty. Made me think of a few different questions, but one is on when you were talking about engaging the DC Council with solutions to be able to provide that. If you were to wave like a policy magic wand, what would that mean for the district? What would you do to be able to create that environment here?
I think the first thing, we just ended budget season. And so DC just finalized their budget. I think it was something like $19 billion, I think is what their budget was this year. And so if I could wave a magic wand, there are quite a few, probably about 4 policy priorities we have this year. And the first one would be making Give SNAP a raise, a permanent non-lapsing funding program that would be a full year. So currently right now, where it stands with DC Council is they approved legislation the end of 22. And through this budget season, they just approved an amendment that would allocate $39 million to Give SNAP a raise, as well as an additional $20 million for excluded workers. But that funding is only depending on the surplus revenue. So the CFO has to determine whether or not DC has surplus revenue. And if they do, then they'll allocate that $39 million to district SNAP residents. But it's only for 9 months. So it goes from January 1 to September 30. So it follows the fiscal year. If I can wave a magic wand, that would be non-lapsing funding. That would just be funding that would just continue on. The original piece of legislation is for $52 million. And that's for a full year for all of our SNAP participants. And that's based on SNAP participation in 23. So we would have to tweak that and adjust that based off of current SNAP participation, which has increased since the time that legislation was passed. If I could wave a magic wand, it will be to make that permanent non-lapsing funding. If I also could, I would make school meals free. School meals are the only meals that children have to pay for. You don't pay for meals any other place except for K-12. We don't, for the life of us, we don't understand why you make kids pay to eat inside school. And then if they cannot afford the meal, then thankfully DC does not do this, but in other areas, if a child cannot afford the meal, they'll give them an alternative meal in some places. So they get like a sun butter sandwich, which sun butter is like a non-allergenic. It's made from, I think, sunflower seeds. So there's no allergy with it. So they can't serve peanut butter inside schools. But some kids are given a sun butter sandwich. They're not given the hot lunch that comes through the hot lunch line if they can't afford it. So lunch shaming is still a really big deal across a lot of schools in the nation. DC does not do that. They do not tell a child they cannot eat. DC public or DC public charter schools, they do not do that whatsoever. And so we're glad for that. But I would make school meals universally free. Currently, right now, all district students have access to free breakfast. So whether you attend a public school or a public charter school, or if you are a participating private school, all children in DC receive free breakfast across the district. And so we don't have to worry about breakfast. But lunch is what I would make sure so that a child can go throughout the day, student can go throughout the day, and they don't have to worry about, am I going to be able to eat today? I can't afford breakfast today. I can get lunch. I can't afford lunch today. I can get breakfast, but I can't afford lunch. So I would wave a magic wand that would do that. If I also had a magic wand, I would ask for additional funding to support WIC. I hear from a lot of mothers with children under the age of 5 that have expressed So not very many in the conversations that I have had consume cow's milk. And so offering some funding at the local level in the form of additional benefits that will allow them to purchase alternative milk varieties. So right now with offer, you can purchase cow's milk or soy milk. And so some additional benefits at the local level that would allow for maybe almond milk or oat milk or goat milk, just any type of other milk alternative, as well as loosening some of the restrictions. And so, there's only so much we can do at the federal level, but having some local level investment that would help our district residents, as well as DC already has universal pre-K, so I think that's great. But yeah, if I could wave my magic wand, that would probably be 3 of the things. There's a lot more that I would do. I think housing is another issue that we have connected to food, but not something that we directly advocate for a lot, but it's still an issue. But if I could wave a magic wand for food related items, it would probably be those 3 initially.
Those are all really important things that impact not just food, but almost every other area of policy. Would make a lot of things better if you were able to wave a wand to be able to do that. My next question is tied to your earlier point about food sovereignty. So I know a big thing, at least with the AANHPI community, like you said, is being able to access cultural foods that are familiar to folks, foods that they would normally prepare and thus accept and be able to get the nutrition they need from. A big part of that in a lot of AANHPI communities comes from small business owners, usually families setting up their own grocery stores, like think about like Chinatowns or Little Indias or Koreatowns. So I was curious, especially from your family's background and your father's background as a franchise business owner, what are some policy things that can be done to even help empower that? Because it usually is very difficult. There's a lot of barriers.
Yeah, so there's 2 things that DC does that I think empowers that, and it does really allow our small business. I am an advocate for small businesses. But I think the Nourish DC Collaborative, which offers support to our small businesses in the form of technical assistance, mentoring, so they come together in a cohort fashion with their business model, and they can bring to the table their challenges, their needs, and through this collaborative experience, they're able to address that. So if they need help with budgeting, if they need assistance with maybe any sort of financial challenges that they may be having as a small business owner, they're able to work through those. And so that they have a successful small business wherever they are in the districts. The Fresh Food Fund, it encourages, again, small businesses to open up grocery stores in the district, particularly in Ward 7 and 8. And so I think making sure that those that have those small businesses that are serving particular communities, making sure that they're aware of that, because a lot of times it's the awareness. I don't know that this program exists. I don't know that I can get support in this area. One of the things, I sit on the executive committee for the Good Food Purchasing program, for DC's chapter of the Good Food Purchasing program. So a lot of our work involves values aligned procurement. And so making sure that DC government, schools, several different areas, that there's these 5 components of food purchasing that DC abides by. Part of that is local sourcing. And so making sure you're being intentional. It is about having a safe workforce, as well as supporting our local economy through local businesses. And so I think making sure that you're continuously offering that support to our small businesses, giving them tips, tools, trainings, whatever it is that they need, and then making them aware of how they can do business in DC. One other thing I think that has been big, I used to work for a small business when I first moved to Georgia. And the way that my boss at the time started her business was a small business set aside grant, not grants, but small business set asides from the federal government. So she did a lot of federal contracting. And so a lot of the funding that she was awarded through these contracts was due to a small business set aside that the federal government has. And so they encourage their entities, so jails, hospitals, prisons, school, they can set aside up to 25% of their business to a small minority woman-owned business. And so that was how she got a lot of her start. And so I think making sure that there are incentives, that there's a focus. I mean, we shouldn't have to, it should just kind of be second nature, but making sure that those communities of color, that they do feel supported and that they know that the resources and the programs are available for them to open up businesses that would support the residents. Mm-hmm.
It's amazing. I didn't know about so many of those programs, so it was really awesome to learn about that. Another question I had, which is kind of getting more into a different topic, and I'm sure you experienced this too when you were a high school teacher. A big thing I always thought about when it came to my students was also in terms of the ways that food or lack thereof impacted their mental health.
Mm-hmm.
Their ability to just be able to cope with the stresses of life and the other stressors that they were dealing with in the neighborhoods that they were in, and their own family life and balance there. So I was curious, where do you see that correlation between food security and mental health, and what do you think are ways that we can address that better?
So we know that food is a basic human right. Food safety and shelter, those are the three things I always say that we have to have first. Before we start talking about anything else, we have to talk about food safety and shelter. A person has to feel full. They have to feel confident that they know where their next meal is coming from. They have to feel safe in their environment, whether it's home, school, wherever they are. And then they have to know that they have some place where they can get rest. And so we want to make sure that we're fueling our body, we're feeding our body, so that it's at optimal peak condition. Now, I'm not a doctor, but we know that when people are fed, that they're not hungry, especially when students feel full during the school day, we know that they perform better. We know that their behavior is better. They're less likely to be absent and tardy from school. Their participation and concentration is better in school. And so they're not overburdened with the stress of, I didn't get to eat today. I know I participate in free lunch. My friend doesn't. So not only do I have to go in line to maybe the free lunch line, but my friends don't. And so now there's this increase, there's this disparity, and there's this stigma attached. My friends are gonna know that, my friends are gonna know that I don't have, money, quote unquote, to afford food. These are some of the things that my students would experience. In Atlanta, they attended a school that was in a very financially diverse community. So students that went to the school were all across the income spectrum. And so a lot of my students, again, lived below the poverty line, but a lot of their friends were extremely wealthy. And so their friends didn't know what it was like to not, have access to food. They could go out to lunch. They could get in their cars, go out to lunch. They pull out credit cards at school. My students couldn't. So instead of letting their friends know that they qualified for free lunch and that was how they were going to eat, they did not eat. So I'd rather go through school all day long and not eat anything. And then by the time they get to me, they're just off the wall. Their teachers are telling me, well, they're having this behavioral problems, they're having this behavior challenge, but a lot of it is because they haven't ate today and they're so worried about what everyone else is thinking, that stigma tied to food, that's tied to food. I had a professor once, tell you this short story. I had a professor once when I was in graduate school, and she was an elementary school principal. And she was after school one day, and this school also had ECE, so they had early childhood classrooms. And so one of the little boys was getting ready to get on the bus, but he was like hysterical crying. Like they couldn't calm him down. Like he was just going absolute ham, but the bus driver couldn't pull off because they couldn't calm him down. And so my professor, again, who was a principal, got wind of it, and they brought her out, and they brought the little boy into her office, and she put him on her lap, and she said, what's wrong? And he goes, I'm hungry. That was it. He was just hungry. And so she said she kept snacks in her desk for that reason. So she said she handed him 2 packs of crackers, and he ate the crackers and immediately calmed down, was completely fine, 2 seconds later, then gave him 2 more. and got on the bus and he went home. And she was like, those are the types of issues that she would have to deal with. Is you have a 3 or 4-year-old that can't adequately express what they're feeling. I just know that I'm hungry, but I'm flustered, I'm frustrated, I just need something to eat. Making sure that they did eat lunch, but there's all these other things that are going on, especially in a child's mind, but also in an adult's mind. You're going through the workday. I've got to go to the grocery store. I have to feed my family, but I don't have enough. Even if I do receive SNAP, even if I do participate in WIC, I still don't have enough. SNAP benefits they last on average for about 2.5 weeks, 2 to 2.5 weeks. I don't have enough. That's not enough for one person, and it's certainly not enough for a family, a typical family of 4. So imagine going through your workday not knowing where are you going to get the money to purchase the food that you need to feed your family. That's additional stress that's added. And so we know that hunger doesn't just affect our body, but it affects our mental. And so making sure that we're addressing that if you are participating in any one of the nutrition benefits programs, that those programs are able to sustain a family, that there's enough to get them through the month. And so, but we know that currently doesn't happen. And so, we're glad that DC Council and our leaders are doing work to add benefits to what a current SNAP participant receives. But we have to address, food insecurity, and making sure that district residents have enough so that they can meet those basic needs that they have.
Definitely. And the story you told, it reminded me about this experiment or video that we had to watch when I was in high school in my psychology class. Did you ever see this marshmallow test video? Did they ever show you this video? Did anyone see this marshmallow test video? Is this outdated? It's probably outdated now, but basically they used to do this test where they would put a kid in a room and put a marshmallow in front of them and say, don't eat the marshmallow, I'll be back in 5 minutes. And the kid, and they basically would say, kids who waited the 5 minutes and then ate the marshmallow when they came back would do better in life. But now people have realized that a lot of it had to do with income level and their own sense of security in their homes, because if a kid never knew when their next meal was going to be, they didn't trust that the adult was going to come back in 5 minutes, they would just eat the marshmallow. Or if they didn't have security in other forms, they would just eat it. So that's kind of what that story reminded me of, just that idea.
And now they do it on TikTok for fun.
Oh, no. Oh, really? Oh, it's a TikTok trend now?
Yeah, they'll put some candy in front of a child and say, don't eat it. And then they'll say, mommy or daddy will be back. And then it's kind of like a behavioral test now, just to see if they'll eat it or not. But it's in front of a toddler.
Oh my gosh.
And so some toddlers are like, I'm going to eat it. It's candy. Some are not. So it's like a behavioral test is what I see now.
Oh my gosh. Yeah, that's what it originated as. The marshmallow test was to see your behavior. That's so interesting. I didn't realize it was a TikTok trend now. I guess now moving into the things that we can do as individuals and on the grassroots level, what are some of the things that the rest of us can do to be able to help address these issues of food inequity and access in DC or in our own communities?
Yeah, I think one of the things is probably one of the easiest ways is just making yourself aware. Without having to get too far into the weeds as an individual that may not be closely connected to food in your community. Just educate yourself, spend time reading and learning about what food insecurity is, the different terminology. So for example, we don't typically say food deserts. We address the reasons why there is a lack of grocery stores in a particular area. And we know that comes from disinvestment. So we talk about the disinvestments regardless of what they are. And so just educating, reading and learning about food in general. And I think another way is donating. If you have excess food, DC has a very high food waste percentage. And so if you know that you're going to the grocery store, wherever, and you know that this particular company is not repurposing their food, for lack of better words, maybe encouraging them to repurpose that food, to connect with different resources and different organizations that could help them repurpose and repackage the food that is usable. And so I know Food Recovery US is one that does a lot of work in DC when it comes to addressing food waste. But I think the biggest, that's probably, I think just learning about just food issues, knowing that when budget season comes up every year that, we do a lot of work when it comes to making sure that those food is always, there's something food related that we're going to try to advocate for. We have some federal legislation that as DC residents, of course, we have no representation, but that we should still be knowledgeable from. So I think everybody at a very basic level can just kind of learn about various food issues across the district. And that federal legislation, Farm Bill, child nutrition reauthorization, because you'd be surprised. You may not have these conversations every single day, but when you are going to the grocery store, when you're going out to eat with your friends, when you're going out to lunch, there are food workers that are relying on these programs that you may not know about. So maybe another way, just thanking the food service staff at your restaurant. Not that I think any of you all would be rude, but thanking your food service staff. Just being more polite, just being more kind to our waiters, our waitresses, because a lot of them are underpaid. They don't get paid based off of the value that they bring. Someone has to, they're serving you, they're offering you a service or offering us a service. And so, just a simple thank you, recognizing them for the work that they're doing. And then again, that the federal programs, realizing that those often support our service-based industry workers. So our waiters, waitresses, they're relying on a lot of our federal programs because they are paid a minimum wage. We know that it is expensive to live in DC. So a lot of them do probably, I don't want to assume, but may or may not struggle when it comes to paying for other things outside of food.
That's really amazing. I think we can all definitely do more to become more aware and be able to do those things. My last question for you on a more kind of touchy note is, what is one of the most memorable or meaningful experiences you've had through this work that kind of drives why you do it?
Okay, this is one. When I was in Georgia, so all of my work in Georgia was with early care. So if all my stories are about 3-year-olds, that's who I worked with primarily. It was little kids. I went on a site visit with one of my coworkers, and we would do site visits to childcare providers and daycare homes to make sure that they were following federal regulations and state guidelines as far as being a childcare provider. And so we happened to go to one site, and we have to observe the lunch. So we have to make sure that they're serving lunch, and the meal items meet the meal pattern requirements for participation in this program. And so we're downstairs in the kitchen or in the little lunch area where they're eating, and all the kids file in and they're sitting at their little table, and we're just watching them gulp down ketchup. They're scooping it in with their chicken nuggets. They're scooping it in with their chicken nugget and they're just licking the ketchup off the chicken nugget. And I'm just that is so gross. But whatever you like. So we watched them, chicken nuggets and milk is what they were eating. And they were, as it was being handed to them, they would eat it. And so I'm just looking at them that is just, but okay. All right. And so as they finished their meal, they walk up to me and my coworker and they go, "You're my best friend." And I was I've never even met you, but I love you. You're just the sweetest. And so that was probably one of my favorite, is just, we're here to do a job. Kids don't know. They have no idea why we're there. They just know there's a bunch of grown people. Why there are a bunch of adults watching me eat chicken nuggets and ketchup. But they look at us and they're just "Oh my gosh, you're my best friend? Are you really my best friend?" And so that was probably one of my favorite moments in the work that I do.
I love that so much. Well, thank you, LaMonica, for this amazing discussion. Right now, I would love to open it up to any questions that anyone has, either here in the room or in the chat. Is this on?
Is this on? Oh, okay, perfect. So like Mayura mentioned, if anyone in the audience has any questions, we'll go ahead and hand the mic over to you. To our virtual attendees, if you have any questions, please feel free to drop it in the chat box and we will get to you shortly. But first off, I want to give a huge thank you to our amazing speakers here tonight. LaMonica, it was just so informative being able to hear everything that you shared, just all the intricacies and the layers that comes with this issue. And then Mayura, for your flawless moderation and being able to guide our discussion here tonight. So again, if folks have any questions, feel free to raise your hand. But before we move into the audience Q&A, we're going to ask all of our attendees here, if you're in person and also if you're virtual, to take our audience survey. If you're in person, you'll see a QR code on your desk, so feel free to scan it. If you would like a physical copy, please raise your hand and we'll be handing physical copies of the survey over to you. And we also have pens as well. For our virtual attendees, I'll be dropping the link to the survey in the chat box very shortly. And then we'll resume with the audience Q&A.
I taught a
Okay, so quick update at 6:55, we'll resume with our audience Q&A. I see that we have a couple of questions in the chat box. So for our virtual attendees, again, if you have any questions, feel free to drop it in the chat box and we'll get to you shortly. For our in-person attendees, if you have any questions, comments, if there's anything in the conversation that really piqued your interest and you'd like to learn more about, definitely raise your hand and we'll pass the mic over to you. Okay, so I think we're good to resume for the audience Q&A. So I see that we have a few questions in the chat box from Kiana and Clay. So maybe we can go ahead and get started with those, and then we'll turn to our in-person attendees if y'all have any questions.
Great. And I think the Kiana's question, which I no longer can see in the chat, but I believe
Let me go ahead and pull it up.
I believe her question was on
Yes,
the
so
restrictions on
Kiana's-
free lunch.
Yes, question was, what are some of the restrictions
Sorry.
on making school lunch?
I'm sorry. Okay. So I think the question was on what are the restrictions on making school lunches free?
I don't think there's any restrictions on making school lunch free. It's just a process of making them free. And so the conversation that we currently have is with OSSI. OSSI is the Office of the State Superintendent of Education. They administer all of the child nutrition programs except for WIC inside the district. And so the conversations on building a successful universal school meals, which is what the legislation is called. Legislation has already been introduced in DC. It just hasn't had a hearing yet before DC Council. In order to have a successful piece of legislation and to pass successfully, we have to have an understanding of how many students are in DC schools. So there's about a little over 100,000 DC school students between our charter schools, our public schools. What's going to be the cost? Because meals are still reimbursed at the federal level. It's just that students don't pay for them. So essentially DC government will cover the cost for those meals. And so what's going to be the cost? And now we need to talk to school nutrition staff to find out what's the average cost of the meal that you're paying, as well as like built into the legislation is a full-time staff person to actually administer this and to do the work essentially. And so without going way in the weeds into the legislation, it's not a restriction, but more so, what is it gonna cost DC in order to implement this program? So like right now, meals in DC are free and paid. So breakfast is free. The reduced meal rate is covered through some local level reimbursements that DC gets, and then we only have the paid rate. And then we have CEP, which is a community eligibility provision, which allows schools that have an identified student percentage of more than 40%. So more than 40% of the students in that school reside in a SNAP eligible household. They're homeless, they're classified as runaways, they participate in TANF, or their household receives TANF. If that percentage is over 40%, then that entire school, regardless of income, that school has their meals served for free. So the students in those schools don't have to worry about the cost of meals. But to implement the policy at the local level, it's just conversations on what this would cost DC Council, and then how do we, not DC Council, but DC, and then how do we implement that? What are the steps to implement that, essentially?
Yeah. Another question in the chat right now is, what do you think about the accessibility of farmers markets as people are gaining more interest in supporting small and local producers?
I'm a big fan of farmers markets. Farmers market season officially started here around April. June 1st marked the start of the electronic farmers market nutrition program, which is for our WIC participants. So they can utilize their WIC benefits electronically at farmers markets. I think farmers markets increase the access to fresh produce. So we know that you can get it at a grocery store, but now you can get it even fresher through a farmer's market because it's local. And then again, supporting that local economy, because a lot of our farmers live in the communities that these farmers markets exist. So whether or not you all may realize, Fresh Farm operates a lot of the farms. I just had a meeting with them today. I think they operate 23 farms across the district. And I want to say the DuPont Circle Farmers Market, I think that's one of the biggest ones, if it's not the biggest one. I don't know if it's theirs, but it's a big one.
It's theirs.
It's theirs? Okay. I didn't know if it was theirs, but I know it's a big one. But our farmers markets, Fresh Farm, they operate about 23 farmers markets across the district. And with those farmers markets is an opportunity for our SNAP participants, our WIC participants, to increase their consumption of locally grown foods. And so a lot of them, they do a SNAP for SNAP dollar match. So for example, if you spend $5, you get $5 back. If you are participating in SNAP, you get 75% off of their community food box. And so our farmers markets serve as a way to make sure that households, especially those that are experiencing or living with low income, we're increasing their accessibility or the availability of fresh produce. Yeah.
Love the Fresh Farm farmers markets.
Good. I'm sure that they love to hear that.
Well, any other questions from either our virtual audience or from y'all in here?
The microphone. I know you're talking about how a lot of people don't know about the programs that are available. My sister's a med school student, and a lot of her friends and her are like completely on loans. And so they'll go to the financial aid office and they'll really like helpfully explain everything that's available to them. And most of them get like benefits each month for housing, not housing, food and utilities. And there's so many programs available to them. And they like lay it out so well, what they need to do to apply. And so it's so easy for them to like gain access to these resources. But how do you make like all the programs that are available more widely known to people who can't just like go to a financial aid office? And how do you go about like making these programs known to like the wider public?
It's pretty much just a matter of increasing our outreach. So we do a lot of Campus Hunger is one that we'll be working on, increasing our Campus Hunger outreach once students come back to school in the fall. And so making sure that if they have a college hunger office, that that College Hunger Office knows about SNAP, that they're trained to process or at least complete a SNAP application or a pre-screening. Making sure that, because it's not just students that attend the college, it's also employees and staff that could be facing food insecurity as well and eligible for these programs. And so it's making sure that we're doing targeted, intentional outreach. And so that's kind of what our campus hunger outreach will look like, but also making sure that we're present in various different spaces. So at our farmers markets, where do we get the highest utilization of SNAP benefits and WIC benefits, and making sure that we're there so that those participants know this is how you can utilize a SNAP for SNAP match at your farmers markets. Did you know that you can apply for the WIC Farmers Market Nutrition Program? Do you have questions about your SNAP case? Are there challenges that you're having so that residents that are participating in these programs, you know, they know about them and that we're seated there. They can see us, for example, as a visible access point. And so having a place at our highest need areas. So we work a lot with senior centers. And so going to our senior centers or our senior housing facilities, we'll be at the Mayor's Senior Symposium next week. This week we were just at Senior Fest. So making sure that we're in place and that we're visible and that we're knowledgeable so that we can hand out outreach flyers, share our contact information. Because you're right, a lot of people don't know about the programs, or maybe they participated at one point and they kind of stopped participating, but they're still eligible and they're interested in restarting. I was at a rally at the Wilson Building about a month or so ago, a housing rally, and I spoke about WIC and SNAP benefits, and I had someone come up to me on behalf of their daughter to make sure that their daughter was participating in WIC. And so a lot of times, you're right, people don't know about them. They also don't know who to contact. And so we want to make sure that we serve as an intermediary between state agency staff and our district residents so that they know that they can come to us if they have a question, because not that the state agencies are not helpful, but we work directly with our state agencies, so we have the capacity to work more closely with our district residents and then taking what we're hearing to our state agencies and creating a solution or a strategy. So if it's more access points, if it's resources that we can increase our outreach, we're able to do that. But it really is just targeted outreach and making sure that we're visible and we're knowledgeable so that we can address our residents, and then knowing where the gaps are, where services are needed. And so I just told my staff the other day, that's why we want to make sure that we're at events where we can be, so that we can talk to community leaders, we can talk to residents, we can have these conversations with DC Council so that we know where the gaps are, we know where the need is, and then we can strategize and find out, is this a matter of a program change, or do we need to apply funding, local level funding at a certain area? So it's having these strategic conversations. But it really is just being out and visible and having conversations in the community.
Thank you so much. Any other questions?
Hello. I was listening to a podcast a really long time a while ago that kind of mentioned or talked about food deserts a little bit. Oh, and it talked about how when neighborhoods would advocate for like increased food access and progress towards food security, that other residents and typically like wealthier residents like kind of actively resist that, normally with the rhetoric of like the free market basically, and like it's particularly like with fast food chains and like healthier food options like grocery stores and things like that. I'm just wondering if you've seen that at all, like in your advocacy work, and or if you've seen any other like similar dynamics of like resistance to efforts towards progress towards food security.
Yeah, that's a really good question. Someone just asked me a couple weeks ago. We had FRAC had an anti-hunger policy conference, And we had a child nutrition leadership meeting the day before, and we were talking about healthy school meals. And one of our state directors she lives in DC, and she was asking what sort of opposition have we heard when it comes to advocating for universal school meals. And I said, ironically, DC has not offered any opposition. DC is one of the few places that is very supportive of especially passing legislation that will support children. Who doesn't want to make sure that a child has access to enough food to eat? And so we haven't heard of any opposition yet. I'm not going to say that it doesn't exist. There were some challenges when it came to passing Give SNAP a Raise. And so we knew that the $52 million was a pretty high price tag. And so there was amendments to how we were going to pass it. And so suggestions on what funding stream or funding source could we utilize. And one of those amendments, there was some opposition expressed by the business community. And it was involving a tax that was on the verge of sunsetting. And instead of us allowing it to sunset, we would utilize that tax, repurpose it to support Give SNAP a Raise. And it didn't, business community wasn't in agreement with that. And so sometimes opposition does occur, but that's why we try to make sure that we strategize and that we bring all of our community leaders and that we paint the picture, so to speak, so that everyone understands. But DC does a very good job because overall DC is pretty liberal. Not too many conservative voices that are opposing feeding those that are experiencing food insecurity. And the legislation that we have passed, it's pretty much just been an issue of what does the budget look like for that fiscal year, and how can we reallocate funding so that we can support. So it hasn't been a matter of DC Council doesn't want to support it. We have trouble getting support from district residents or leaders. It's just been a matter of looking at the budget and making sure that the funding is allocated appropriately, and it just makes sense from a financial standpoint. But good question, really, really good question.
Any other questions? Oh, yes.
I know you were mentioning a little bit earlier that there's a lot of layers to kind of get to a grocery store. There's a lot of layers to even afford groceries, to provide food on the table for your families. I guess I was wondering, like, what do you think is the first tangible step to tackling something with that many layers? Do you think it's transportation? Do you think it's providing, accessible grocery stores? Do you think it could be providing subsidies for food? I guess I'm just curious, like, in something that is so pronged, what is the first tangible step?
That's a really, really good question. And I don't think it's an issue of you take the first step, you take the second step, and you take the third step. It's a matter of everybody working collaboratively and for us to address the problem. So if you are transportation department looking at the access to grocery stores, so are there metro stops in this community? What do we have to do to increase the number of metro stops? Like I said, we have the Metro, I think it's called Metro Lift, I think is the name of the program, where SNAP participants will receive a discounted rate for utilizing Metro. And so I think it's, the transportation department assessing where is it that they can make improvements or adjustments or institute initiatives that are going to support that area. If we're talking about affordability of food, we have Give SNAP a Raise. Before that, it was the SNAP Expansion Act, which essentially increased the minimum benefit at the local level that a SNAP participant would receive. And so talking to DHS, who administers SNAP in DC, what can we do at the local level, working with the state agency that administers SNAP, and then talking to the actual, let's backtrack, talking to the Office of Planning, which they're the ones that help to determine where we're going to put a grocery store inside the district. Looking at the layout of BC, looking at the space, the availability, having those conversations, saying, yep, the Capital Beltway space is where we want to make sure that we have grocery store. If it's in Northeast, making sure that, yes, this is where we want to have a grocery store, and then having conversations with those grocery store companies to make sure that we can talk about equitable access. And so making sure that the product offerings in that grocery store are going to meet the needs of those in the community. And so food sovereignty, the power to determine what type of food is available in your community. And so I don't think it's a matter of having separate conversations on who goes first and who tackles it first. I think it's everyone coming to the table together with all these interconnected areas, and then everyone taking action at the same time to determine how they can best execute it. So if it just so happens that we can pass legislation for district residents to receive additional funding, then that just happened to happen first. If it's a much longer process, to increase the number of metro stops, because we know that we have to make sure that those stops are safe. We have to make sure that there's drivers. We have to improve the rail system. So there's things that may take a much longer process, but the initial step is bringing all the people to the table to determine what's a collaborative step that we all can take at the same time, and then executing it from there. Really great question. I like that question too.
Hi, thank you so much for talking, and I really, really appreciated all your insightful information about food security in DC. You mentioned that the three basic necessities for humans are food, safety, and shelter, and you also mentioned the Black and Latinx community that are often impacted by this. And I was just wondering if you could expand upon just the homeless population in DC and how they often and mostly are affected by not having any of the three access. Because I believe you focus a lot on schools and systems and grocery stores, but just like not having access to that.
Yeah, so ironically, I just had this conversation with my Lyft driver on the way here. I was sharing when I first got here that I'd worked all day and it kept going when I got on the Lyft. And I was not expecting that, for someone to ask so many questions. And the questions he asked were about our unhoused population. And so when we talk about our unhoused or homeless population, we have to look at it from how we define that. Because for some, it's not those that do not have a place to go, like they're living on the street. There are some that are living in emergency shelters. There are some that are living in housing communities, but it's temporary housing communities. And so within those facilities, how are they making sure that residents there have access to it? And so if you happen to be unhoused and you are not in a shelter, or you do not live in temporary housing, what are some of the programs that are available, making sure that there are, which is some of the things that we do. We share openly on our social medias, as well as with our partners, places where anyone can go and get a hot meal. So maybe a church is they're preparing hot meals on this Saturday. Martha's Table does a lot of sharing resources with the community about Martha's Table, working with those that specifically go out and work at the community level, at the grassroots level, with our unhoused populations. In Atlanta, we call them tent cities, where people would legit have tents set up, and this is just where they lived. And a lot of times it was under bridges, underpasses, or overpasses. They lived under the overpass. And so it was going there where they live and to bring the resources to them. That's another element to this work, is not expecting those that have a need to go out and meet their own need, but making sure that we're bringing what it is that they need to them. Same thing for individuals that may live in an emergency shelter or a temporary shelter, making sure that they know, especially because they may not have a kitchen, they may not have a way to prepare hot meals. So if they're coming to get groceries, they can't utilize fresh or frozen. they may need to use their SNAP benefits, because there are a lot of times there are individuals that are unhoused, but I am receiving SNAP benefits. And so it's utilizing those benefits to purchase ready to eat items, which you currently can't do with your SNAP. That's a federal regulation. It's not anything that DC has done, but federally you can't use your SNAP benefits at like Kroger and to go buy rotisserie chicken. You can't do that. They don't let you. And so it's making our federal government aware that we do have individuals that, even if they are not unhoused, maybe you live in a domestic violence shelter, but my current living situation, or you could be a college student and I don't have access to a full kitchen to prepare a full meal. And so a ready to eat meal is the best way to meet that need. So making sure that individuals are aware of that, but then, and also from a provider perspective, so these emergency shelters, making sure that they are aware of the types of programs that they can participate in. So making sure that they're connected to like Capital Area Food Bank, and so that their residents know about TFAP, that if they need assistance with TANF, that their staff can help with TANF. If it's a matter of signing individuals up for SNAP or answering SNAP questions, that we're signing them up for SNAP. And so also making sure that they're participating in other federal programs that would allow them to serve free meals to their residents, and then at a higher reimbursement rate, so that they're getting more money back for serving a federal program, because they are serving a sensitive population. And so there's several different ways to kind of connect the dots when it comes to those that are unhoused, but we work with a lot of our different community partners so that they know that these are the different programs and opportunities and initiatives available to support specifically like the unhoused population.
Thank you so much for your question. Any other questions?
Hi, thank you for coming in to speak. I recently volunteered at a food pantry, and they were kind of telling me about how a lot of the people that come in for the first time are like crying because of like the stigma around going to a food pantry. And you talked about how a lot of children will go hungry because they don't want that separate meal. For those that are unable to afford a school lunch, how would you go about like addressing or trying to solve like the kind of stigma around not having access to, I guess, that food? Because I guess in certain areas, they may not have the budget to allow them to all have a free meal. So like kind of addressing that or figuring out how to let them eat and then without that kind of stigma around it.
Yeah, so stigma is something that we address often in our work, and it's important to advocacy and outreach. And so reducing those unnecessary restrictions for people to participate. So one of the things that we've just been working through most recently is looking through our SNAP application. And we've been working with our state agency on a elderly simplified application process. So it's a shortened process for our older adults that are 60 and older. And so that the typical SNAP application is 68 pages. The shortened application for our older adults is only 8 pages. And so it is reducing the unnecessary restrictions that are placed on our older adults, so they have a much easier time participating in SNAP and submitting that application. If you look at the full SNAP application, currently there's a domestic violence question on there. There's also a question related to convicted felons. And so working with our state agency to have conversations about how can we kind of remove those questions from the application altogether, because we don't want to further stigmatize someone who is a returning citizen or someone who is a domestic violence survivor, because that's further trauma inducing. So we want to make sure that we're reducing as much harm and as much trauma, because there's already trauma and harm associated sometimes with participating in nutrition programs and receiving those benefits. When we look at our school meals, that's why we advocate for universal school meals, because a student or a child should be able to get their lunch, not go through a separate line, not have to identify themselves in an additional way, so that those around them know that they are receiving a reduced or free meal. based off their income, because we know that's what it is. If my friend has to pay for a meal, but I don't, why are you paying? It may be an innocent question. Why do you pay for your meal? Or why don't you have to pay for it, but I have to pay for it? And then the questions, you keep at just being an inquisitive child. Now, you know that my family doesn't have enough money to pay for a school lunch. When we're talking about WIC and WIC participation, EWIC has helped with reducing some of that stigma. So prior to WIC, I'm not sure how many people are familiar with WIC, but prior to last year, WIC was fully implemented into the district last year. Prior to that, families would have a WIC booklet, and they would have to separate their WIC approved items from the rest of their grocery store items, and the cashier would have to check off on this book their WIC approved items. It was a very manual process, but it was also, again, potentially stigmatizing and trauma inducing for those that are participating, because I've got the grocery store cashier who is probably, who may or may not be patient with me trying to check off these items. I've got people behind me that can see that I'm on WIC, which it's because I need some assistance. And so EWIC removes all of that stigma. You keep all your items together, and it's just a matter of you swiping your card at the grocery store. No one knows unless they're familiar with what an EWIC card looks like. Same thing with SNAP. Our SNAP benefits not being way back in the day, being colored money. Way back in the day, they used to be different colors. Now it's just the EBT card. So you just swipe your card and you just go. The approved items will come off and it's fine. But prior to that, it was your money wasn't your food stamps, which is what it was called back then. It was a clear indication that you were on food stamps. It wasn't like it is today. So removing those very visible signs, but also the paperwork that comes with administering that program. And so again, that goes into the SNAP application process for a lot of our participations. TFAP, not asking a resident to identify themselves beyond their first name. You don't have to, when you're participating in TFAP, you don't have to give your income or any other identifiable information. It's just a matter of your first and last name, and that is just to verify who you are. You are who you say you are in their system. But not telling a person you can't come back to a TFAP office or coming back to a TFAP location because you've already been here today. Those types of restrictions don't exist with TFAP. And so removing those restrictions, making those that are servicing our families and individuals that are receiving benefits, making sure that they're educated on these stigmas, and that some of the questions and the way that you're describing, people can describe the situation and that they're treating people can be further trauma inducing. And we never want to put someone in a position where they feel traumatized or stigmatized, because again, food is a basic human right. Everyone should have access to it regardless of income. So it's nothing that you should feel ashamed of at any point in time.
Okay. With that, I think that closes us out. So thank you all so much for your wonderful questions, and obviously a huge thank you to you, LaMonica, for the thoughtful conversation this evening. And again, thank you to everyone that also joined here in person and virtually. There are 4 more sessions coming up this summer. WLPs are every Wednesday from 6 to 8 Eastern, both in person here in DC and virtually over Zoom. Next week, the WLP session is on AANHPIs and National Security and International Affairs. And you can register on our website at capal.org and view all of our upcoming events. Follow us on social media at CapalDC. And thank you to everyone, and we'll see you next week. Have a good evening.
Thank you.